Today we are here with part three of our Systems and Processes series. We've previously looked at the design process in two halves, but I said when I was doing it that procurement is such a monster that I really wanted to pluck procurement out and deal with it in its own right. So that is what we are doing today. I think things are changing in our industry. Our clients are AI assisted. We are AI assisted. Everything's changing a little bit. It feels a bit like a tipping point, or it feels like things are, it feels like things are shifting quite a lot. And I think we need to adjust our positioning in order to meet this new landscape that we find ourselves in. So I've got some suggestions for that today. I am going to begin, first of all, with an overview of what we're going to be talking about today. So I think, as an industry, when we look at procurement, we've got a couple of blind spots, and I'd like to dig into those blind spots and see if we agree and what we think about them. Then I'm going to cover what procurement is, look at the full process. I've got a thought experiment, which is comparing what we do to what John Lewis does and figuring out how we charge using that piece of logic. So it's new logic. Feel free to push back. I'm going to talk about whether we're working as agent or principal, which is sort of the key decision that you need to make when you're confronted with procurement. I'm going to tell you what I think your client needs to know and how to tell them, when to tell them. And then I'm going to skip over the White Label Studio and we're going to go to Q&A. It's going to be quite a lengthy one, I imagine, probably another hour, getting on for an hour for the presentation. So a little bit longer than the norm, but we've got a great deal to cover. Now, I'm going to start with a disclaimer because what I'm going to be talking about today, there's an awful lot of legislation that controls the procurement side of our business. And it's important that you have proper professional advice. I am an interior designer, I'm not a lawyer. So I am not giving you legal advice. I just want to make that clear. I have researched thoroughly. I'm aligned with the BIID. I believe that the information I'm giving you is accurate, but the law is specific. It changes. Your situation is your own. You need to get everything that you put in front of a client, and indeed your processes, checked over by a professional. So I am here to point out things in the landscape. Your legal advisor is there to make sure that you're protected within it. So please get your stuff checked, and we'll talk about all of that, the contractual side of things as we go. So I mentioned that I think we have two blind spots, and this is part of the organizing logic of today's presentation. First of all, this is the AI related subject. I call it 5%. Teaching at KLC, one of the first hopes in young designers that we would crush was the idea that when you're a designer, what you do all day long is you design. And actually, I'm sure the majority of you now know that what you do all day is organize and meet and, run a business and all that kind of stuff. And the lovely design bit is a minority of what we do. But what we're perceived as by the market, by our clients, is designers. And they think what we're doing is this design bit. And I worry, I'm catastrophizing, that with AI, things are going to shift. And if all we're seen as is concept developers, as designers, it becomes possible to justify the idea of taking that and going and doing it yourself. And what we're not doing is presenting in a really persuasive way all the other stuff that we do. So I think, there's almost like a blind spot to our process. And procurement is such a massive part of it. And it's so complex. And I never liked doing it that much, because it's a bore and a lot of work. And if the client decides to do it for themselves, that's what they would be getting into. So I think it's important for us to be able to enunciate exactly what it is that we do for the sake of our own businesses and our future, the longevity of our businesses. Then we get into a second blind spot, which is There's this phrase I keep hearing, which is double dipping. And when I speak to clients and I suggest that some of the stuff they're charging on procurement comes in under a handling fee or under markup, and other things that they're doing would be charged for by time, there's a resistance that I hear from our industry, and the words associated with that are double dipping. People say to me, "Oh, I would be double dipping." Now, today I want to present to you an argument for the justification of you taking a fee and for some parts of the process also charging your time. So we're going to get to that, but I think we have two blind spots, and they have helped me organize what I'm thinking today. So procurement is not just placing orders. As we position ourselves to compete with AI, we should adopt the language of project management, logistics, risk, and professional accountability. You know, we are not just designers. We are organizing highly complex project dynamics and logistics, and we need to own that and present it as part of our services so that we get recognized for the value that we deliver. So procurement actually is something that I think is quite hard for AI to take from us at the moment, because it's about relationships, it's about physical presence, it's about sequential organization, and it's about contingency. It's about, if X, then Y, if Y, then Z. We've got all these factors that affect procurement, and it's a really valuable service that we can offer. So it's a value argument. Your procurement requires physical presence, professional relationships, and that wonderful body of experience that you have from all the other projects that you've run in the past. So, very quickly, what is procurement? Well, there is the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply, so it is a recognized profession, and the activities it is so procurement is the activities associated with acquiring goods and services, encompassing the entire process from identifying needs all the way through to the end of the contract. So it's an intensely complex, lengthy process that is part and parcel of our services. And, we probably don't front end load the information on that sufficiently. In terms of interior design, it's the process by which a designer sources, orders, manages the supply of, and oversees the installation of the fixtures, fittings, and equipment that make up a scheme. Part of it is transactional, part of it is a commercial process, part of it is managerial. Part of it requires you to step in and actually take control of a complex set of factors. A two-part process, in my opinion, argues for a two-part fee structure. So we're going to get to that. Why does it matter? It's an important revenue stream. So, it can be a large part of your business. It also is one of the aspects of our practice that represents the greatest risk to our business financially. And it can be a way of professionally differentiating our business from other businesses, or indeed helping us to express the value of the service that we can offer to our clients. So when it begins, now we have been looking at the design process. So if you look at parts 1 and 2, which are up on YouTube, System Processes Part 1 and 2, we were looking at the design process as a very long timeline, and here it is on the screen as defined roughly by REBA and the BIID. So we have these different stages of the process, and procurement was popped in, as we're starting to develop our design, we're starting to identify the items that are going to have a future role within the scheme. We can begin to collect the information about these bits and pieces that are going into the project. But actually, it starts earlier than this. It starts at the point really of spatial planning. So even when we are doing generic spatial configuration, we are starting to identify need within the project for future product, as yet unspecified, but beginning to take shape within our project. So this is effectively how far back procurement spreads its roots into the design process. So within the largely in systems and processes one, we talked about fee proposals, and we also talked about the possibility of producing an early stage fee proposal that just really dealt with the prep and concept stage, and then coming back with future fee proposals for the rest. I know some designers who begin their spatial planning in concept. So typically you would see spatial planning rock up in when you start developing the design, but sometimes spatial planning goes back to concept. So procurement arguably has its roots in at the concept stage at the earliest point of the design process. So here is the procurement process. I'm going to go through each of these one at a time. We have the spatial planning, the specification of items coming from the spatial planning, the client's approval of the items, the sourcing and quoting for those particular items, then the ordering, and then the delivery and installation. So this is our procurement process. Now, the schedule runs through the entire procurement process. So our procurement schedule starts its life as an FF&E schedule. So it starts its life as a spreadsheet or some form of manifestation, record, some form of document or record that is a list. It's like a shopping list for the project, and it will say 2 sofas, 3 armchairs, 1 coffee table, 1 lamp, 2 pairs of curtains, and it lists everything that is required to transform the project from before to after. So we have the before that we start with, we have the after, which is the vision that we've created, and the FF&E schedule identifies all the necessary parts that are going to help us transition from before to after. So we start with an FF&E schedule. The FF&E schedule becomes the procurement schedule. And when it becomes the procurement schedule, it gathers columns. And the columns that it gathers are things like supplier and code and price and dimensions. And I would argue, and in the documents that I have to share in the White Label Studio, you'll see that it can also include things like order number and delivery date. So we actually have a massive master document for the entire project that allows us to track the entire project effectively through this single document. So our schedule is gathering power and information as the process continues. So stages 1 to 3, schematic layout, is basically spatial configuration. So we start by challenging the spatial logic. We look at circulation. We think about quantities. We haven't committed to any particular product yet. We're just talking in generic terms. And the purpose is functional. It's not commercial. We're not selling any particular product. At the point of specification, we start to identify the real product. So the sofa template that was on the original schematic layout is swapped for something that now represents the shape, the dimensions of an actual piece of furniture. And we begin our FF&E schedule. So each confirmed item gets dropped into the schedule along with things like dimensions, finishes, and quantities. We haven't actually got the price yet. We might actually have a sort of idea of the price, or a price that is a placeholder for the price. And this is when the procurement process actually starts. Our client then signs off on everything. So the selections are presented with visuals, indicative pricing, and lead times. No orders are placed without the client sign off. Then we move into stages 4 to 6. At stage 4, the client has signed off conceptually. on and based on the indicative pricing, and now we firm up our prices. And perhaps if we're talking about, I don't know, a piece of furniture manufactured by cartel, maybe there are three different suppliers who are agents for cartel. Maybe we ask three different suppliers for a price for a single item, and we choose to work with the supplier that seems to be the most reputable, the best value, and so on. So we're starting to request RFQs, request for quotations issued. We're getting prices in. We're comparing our suppliers based on price, quality, and lead time. The schedule gets quoted, gets costed. The client budget becomes the final project budget. Alternatives are proposed where lead times or budgets require flexibility. So we're firming up on the pricing. And again, this is presented to the client, and the client now has a firm price that they're going to approve, and the client approves, and we proceed with the ordering. And we're going to talk about how we proceed with the ordering a little bit further on down the line. So purchase orders are raised and sent, and the schedule becomes a live tracking document. This is where my preferred schedule would have delivery dates, you know, and an order number against each of the items so that I can feel confident that yes, I have ordered it, and I can look at the delivery dates. I can reorder the schedule based on delivery date, and I can make sure that I'm chasing and checking up on the progress of anything that is due to be delivered. And then finally, we have Part 6, delivery, quality control and installation. Logistics coordinated, items received, inspected, photographed, documented, damage managed, installation overseen, final walkthrough and handover, inventory list, warranties and manuals. So that is the process from start to finish. It is substantial, and it's going to, you know, we're going to get a real handle on how substantial this is. So this is the thought experiment that I'm testing on you today. And it's comparing what we do to a retail competitor. Okay, so when we're thinking about, you know, do you go and buy from Roche-Bobois or do you buy from me? We're comparing what, you know, what the client is going to get either way. So what does a retailer do? What is covered by the retail market markup that you charge or a procurement handling charge? What falls within that amount of money that you're going to make from the project? If what we're doing is using the logic of the retailer, which is what I'm doing in this presentation, then this is how it falls. A retailer arguably would maintain trade accounts and relationships with suppliers, hold or have access to stock. They'd have sufficient product knowledge to answer basic questions. They would process the order, they'd arrange standard delivery, and they'd have something to do with statutory warranty and returns under the Consumer Rights Act. Arguably, then, if what we are doing as part of our markup or part of our handling fee is serving the function that of the retail part of the trade, then what we get fairly paid for with this is opening and maintaining trade accounts, doing our product research, evaluation, and selection. I personally have a bit of a sticking point with this next one, specification and scheduling, design-led elements of stage 2 of the procurement process. Now, usually specification and scheduling for me would come in under a fee proposal. So if we're thinking about this logic, maybe it comes in under the handling fee or the markup. Obtaining trade pricing and preparing client estimates, placing purchase orders, standard acknowledgement of order confirmation from supplier, and routine invoicing to the client for the goods. So here's a way of looking at it. For this thought experiment, we are assuming that the handling fee or the markup is covering us for these activities. Okay, this is where the logic then moves. Here's what a retailer would not do. Now, in the video version of this, now I want to just go on fast forward and just go through all of these. So we've got chasing production updates and lead time confirmations, managing lead time changes and communicating them to the client and the wider project team, coordinating phase delivery schedules against build or installation program, because we have to, synchronize the deliveries, liaison with other trades, contractors, electricians, plumbers about sequencing and access, warehouse liaison and storage management, where goods arrive before the site is ready, attendance at or oversight of delivery, physical inspection of goods on arrival, checking quantities, finishes, and condition, photography and documentation of condition on receipt, damage assessment and reporting, raising damage claims with suppliers or carriers, sourcing or specifying replacements, managing redelivery scheduling and the knock-on effects in the program, coordinating installation, sequencing, placement, access, trade coordination, quality checking goods in situ against design intent, remedial work arising from installation issues, styling and dressing, compiling handover documentation, inventory, warranties, manuals, and so on, final client walkthrough and sign-off, any post-handover follow-up on defects or performance. Would John Lewis do this? No, they wouldn't. Not much of that stuff. So my test for, is it inside the handling fee? Is it inside the markup? Would John Lewis do it? Yes. If it is within the retail orbit of the markup or the markup or the handling fee covers it. Would John Lewis do it? No. It's professional project coordination, and the designer is entitled to charge for it. And this is where I hear people saying, but isn't that double dipping? And I think, no, one is a commercial transaction, one is transactional, and one is managerial. It's management. They're two separate activities, and they're charged for in two separate ways. What this means in practice, we have to have complete client understanding of this positioning. Our client needs to understand it entirely at the very beginning and agree to it. Okay, there's a very important element of our contract. So agreed at the outset. Excuse me, sorry. We're the markup of the fee. So this consideration for trade access, sourcing expertise, specification, and order placement. And if acting as principal, we're going to get on to principal and agent, the assumption of retailer liability under the Consumer Rights Act. So that's what your markup and fee covers. And also agreed with the client at the outset, as part of your fee proposal for this stage of the process, a time charge. For all post-order professional services, production monitoring, logistics, delivery coordination, quality control, installation oversight, and any remedial work arising from problems beyond the designer's control. So these are our two ways of charging, and we agree them with, they're part of the fee proposal. They are explained explicitly to the client, and we'll talk about when we tell the client this and how we tell them. I'm going to come back to that. Okay, so before we go any further, I want to get into the two modes of operation that we can adopt. So we can act for the purposes of supply of FF&E, we can act as principal or we can act as agent. These are our two options, and I'm going to get into now what each of those mean. So starting with principal, excuse me, when we act as principal, we contract with the client. So the client has a contract with our business, and our business is the supplier of all of the goods that come under our acting as principal. So behind the scenes, we have all of our supplier relationships, but they are essentially private to us. They are not the concern of the client. We contract with those suppliers, we buy in and we sell on to the client. So the client doesn't necessarily get an inside view of who the underlying suppliers are to our business. That is operation as principal. And when we operate as principal, we mark up the prices that the suppliers are charging us, we add a markup, and we pass that on to the client at a marked up price. That is operation as principal. When we operate as agent, the client has all of the contractual arrangements, all the contractual agreements are between the client and the suppliers. And the client therefore sees who the suppliers are. Everything is transparent. We are operating our first um, our first principle, our first obligation is to operate in the best interests of the client. So the client sees all of this transparent information. The contracts run from the supplier to the client. As the designer, we facilitate these trades. So we organize them, you know, we'll talk about money separately, but we take all of the administrative weight off the client. We do all of the boot work, but the contracts are between the client and the supplier. So that is operating as agent. And if we operate as agent, it's a service that we offer to the client, and we charge a fee for providing that service. So our money is coming from fees, service fees, rather than for any kind of markup on the products themselves. Now, I think the majority of designers that I speak to operate a hybrid or a mixed system. They choose to work with some suppliers under the principal arrangement. So some suppliers they keep behind a wall, and the client contracts with the designer, and the designer supplies to the client the products of these suppliers that they've selected to work with as principal. However, they offer further procurement services where they will introduce the client to other suppliers. The client will contract directly with those other suppliers, and the designer will facilitate those trades, but not participate in those trades. So they're offering some supply as principal and some supply as agent. And the way they are making the choice is because of the trust and the relationship that they have with certain suppliers who they feel they have enough confidence in those suppliers to actually stand in front of those suppliers as if they were part of their business. So that is how they choose those suppliers that they work with as principal. Other suppliers, they might there is an amount, well, we're going to get into this in further detail, but there's an amount of risk that comes with certain aspects of supply, and the designer can offset some of that risk by choosing to act as agent in the supply of other goods. So they are de-risking their business to some extent by choosing to act as agent rather than acting as principal. Now, there might be other reasons why we would choose one or the other. We can perhaps talk about that in questions. So principal versus agent, what actually changes? Acting as principal. So when we act as principal, we as designers contract with our suppliers, and we buy in the products and then sell them on to our clients. And we retain the trade discount. We buy at cost. We sell to our clients at the retail that we determine, the retail price that we determine, and we capture the spread between the two. So we invoice our clients at a marked up price when we act as principal. We own the goods until we sell them on to the client. So we're taking them into our business, and we're reselling them to our clients. And we have full liability. We are entirely responsible for the performance of those goods into the future because we are the retailer. We've taken full retail liability under the Consumer Right Act for those goods. So if there's anything unsatisfactory now or even into the future with the performance of those goods, the client comes back to us, and it's not necessarily a case that the supplier, it depends supplier by supplier exactly what happens to make that right. Alternatively, acting as agent, the client contracts directly with the supplier. So the contract for supply goes between the client and the supplier, and we stand apart from that. All trade discounts belong to the client. Okay, so any reduction in the value, in the cost of the product as it is purchased by whomever, all of the benefits of those discounts belong to the client. We charge a handling fee, and the fee is for the service that we provide in order to facilitate the purchase of the goods, to help the client with the administrative burden of actually acquiring those goods. When we act as agent, when we're acting as principal, the client's money can be commingled with our business money. When we're acting as agent, the client's money has to be held separately. Okay, the minute that the client's money comes into our business account, it can go into a client account, but if it comes into our business account, we start to blur the lines about whether we were actually an agent or whether we've now become a retailer. And I've spoken to some designers, for example, I know I'm just trying to think of some of these online banks. They'll allow you to keep your account to produce different pots for a single bank account, but all of those pots belong to one account. So if you are separating your client's money across different pots that belong to one account, and that is your business account, you're effectively taking the client's money into your business, and you're starting to blur the boundaries around whether you're actually agent or whether you're acting as principal. So client money must be held separately. The retail liability sits with the supplier. So obviously, if something is unsatisfactory, ethically, morally, we'll probably try to do something to help the client rectify it. But if it remains unsatisfactory, it's not our liability. The liability sits with the supplier with whom the client contracted. So the case for acting as principal, it's how we used to work back in the day. It was the traditional model for interior designers, and the spreads were large, and it meant that we weren't so reliant on our fees. The client was a bit stuck because they didn't know where the product came from. There was no reverse image search. They were much less well informed. There wasn't the internet. And therefore, it was possible for us to back end load the profit of the project. So it's the traditional way that we have worked as interior designers. And I know there are different ways of structuring this, but the margin can be substantial. So it can be a more lucrative way of operating if you're operating in a market that will tolerate this way of working. It can also be easier to explain because when we operate as principal, we communicate our method of operation to our clients, and we do it honestly, and we tell them what we're going to do. But there isn't the same onus on us to be transparent as there is when we're agent. Okay, when we're agent, we are operating in the client's best interests, and there is greater onus on us to be much more granular in terms of the detail that we give the client. So acting as principal can be easier to explain. On the negative side, you could end up bearing the responsibility for the satisfaction and the performance of the product for up to 6 years based on the Consumer Rights Act. Additionally, one of the biggest challenges I see with principal is designers who make a large, expensive purchase, and then the supplier, the underlying supplier, goes bust, becomes insolvent. The client has paid the designer has paid the supplier, the designer owes the product to the client, but there is no product because the business has gone insolvent. And that is one reason why a designer might be very careful about which businesses they choose to front as principal and which businesses they would prefer to make introductions between the client and the supplier as agent to protect the designer in the event of a business becoming insolvent. So, principal, pros and cons. Agent. Acting as agent, you are facilitating a trade, you're helping the client with the administrative burden, it's a service that you're providing. You don't have the same level of responsibility for the satisfaction of the product. Some clients like agent operations because they see everything and they feel like they can trust the process more when they see the underlying suppliers, they see the trade price, they know if there are any commissions, there are no secrets at all, everything is transparent. And the client feels like this is a more secure way to operate. And often with agent, our handling fee is not the entire difference between trade price and retail. So there is a financial benefit to the client as well. There's a saving made when the designer operates as agent. I'm going to talk reluctantly about money laundering in a minute, but acting as agent in a particular way can protect you from anti-money laundering legislation. And I'm going to talk about that in a second. So this is a minor or perhaps major benefit of this method of operation. However, you can see that because we are completely transparent when we operate as agent, there's quite a lot to explain to the client. So we're having to be very clear and very detailed in the way that we describe our methods of operation to the client because of the transparency. And more often than not, agent tends to come with lower margins. So a handling fee typically is between 10 and 20% of the value of the product. So that tends to be less than a retail spread between trade and retail tends to be greater than that. So we're accepting a lower margin when we're operating as agent. Okay, then we have hybrid, where some of the suppliers we work with, we act as principal, other suppliers we act as agent, we just make introductions. Perhaps this allows us to increase our margins because some of the stuff we're doing is at retail prices with trusted suppliers. But then we have to explain both methods of operation. We have to explain why, where and when and why we operate as principal, and we also have to explain exactly how we're going to operate as agents. So all of this is beholden upon us and we absolutely must do it clearly. Now, so terminology, to be absolutely clear, if you're operating as principal, you're going to mark up prices. So markup is the difference between what the designer paid to the supplier and what the client pays to the designer. And it's called a markup because it describes the arithmetic of a resale. It's not a fee for a service rendered. It's an actual commercial it's not a fee, it's part of the price of the product. Agent, on the other hand, is a handling fee. It is a fee for a service. It's a fee for the facilitation itself. We call it a handling fee or an administration fee or a procurement fee, and that correctly signals that it's compensation for our labour and expertise. It's not a margin on the goods sold, okay? It is covering you for the cost of a service. Okay, now I'm going to get into legislation. Now, I am not a lawyer. I have got a bit of a handle on what these things are, but really we need professional expert eyes across our businesses to make sure that we are completely compliant and consistent. But here are the pieces of legislation that affect us. Now, operating as agent, you you need to be wary of the Bribery Act. Okay, so a designer acting as agent, if you get a commission on something and you don't reveal it to your client, a commission is effectively a trade discount. You have hidden a trade discount from your client. You are in contravention of the Bribery Act, and there are very significant penalties within the Bribery Act. You can get into it. This is fraud, and you can get into a lot of trouble through the Bribery Act, acting as agent and taking hidden fees. So the entire benefit of any trade discount belongs to the client. And legally advised clients can and do seek restitution. So operating as agent, all trade discounts belong to your client. You cannot take any kind of commission or kickback or anything like that unless you've told the client and the client has approved it. Okay, so if there is a commission coming from a kitchen company that you've introduced the client to, and it's actually part of your design fee, you can clear that with the client, get their approval, and you can take the commission, but everything needs to be transparent. Then we get into the Consumer Rights Act, and this affects you if you're operating as principal. So when you're supplying as principal, you are the retailer of record. Goods must be of a satisfactory quality, fit for purpose, and as described. The client's statutory rights run against the designer, not the manufacturer or the supplier from whom you've bought, and that can be for up to 6 years after delivery. And the manufacturer's guarantee does not displace this. So you can't just fall back on the manufacturer's guarantee. You have a responsibility to your client on an ongoing basis. Then we have the Consumer Rights Act that affects both agent and principal. So, separately from goods liability, the Consumer Rights Act also governs your professional service. So your services must be performed with reasonable care and skill within a reasonable time. Any information written or stated, any information spoken, is binding where the client relies on it, including verbal representations and your promotional materials. And this is where it's really important to have a lawyer look across your entire suite of documents to make sure that they don't contradict, to make sure that everything is saying the same thing consistently. Finally, we have money laundering. Now, money laundering, okay, so I think it's worth researching high value dealer status. So, high value dealer is somebody who sells items that have a value of more than 10,000 euros. So, if any one item, and it's in euros, any one item that you sell, if there's anything you sell individually that has a value of more than 10,000 euros in its own right, you are a high value dealer. And as a high value dealer, you have obligations under anti-money laundering legislation to understand where that money has come from, to know your clients, and so on. Now, you can find out more about this through HMRC's guidance for high value dealers, or from your lawyer, or from the BIID. Now, if as agent, your client pays the supplier direct and no money comes into your business, theoretically, you are not part of the trade theoretically, you've got a bit of protection from being a high value dealer. But if you take the money into your business, even if it goes into a customer account, then you're starting to blur these boundaries. So this is something for you to investigate and make sure that you run your operations in a way that protects you from risk associated with all of these various pieces of legislation. Okay, so here's what we are going to tell our client. We are going to tell our client which model we use. So one or other or both. We're going to tell our client how our fees are calculated. So exactly how we are going to apply fees to the procurement process, within the design process. We're going to tell the client who holds the contract with each supplier. In the case of principal, we hold the contract. In the case of agent, they hold the contract. We're going to tell the client what happens in the event of damage, delay, discontinuation, and maybe arguably insolvency as well. We're going to tell the client how their funds are going to be held. And if it's in a client account, how we are going to ensure the safety of their funds when their funds are in with funds from other clients. So maybe there's a ledger associated with that account to distinguish what money in that account belongs to whom. And we're going to tell the clients which parts of our process are covered by markup or handling fee, and thereafter, which parts of our process are going to be subject to time charges. So this is an overview of the information that is going to go into our documentation and explain to our clients how we operate. And here's when we're going to tell our clients. I would suggest, first of all, we need to tell our clients on more than one occasion. So I would argue that the client needs to have had this put in front of them in one form or another on at least 3 or 4 occasions before procurement begins. So certainly it would be explicit in your terms and conditions, and by explicit I mean absolutely laid out in detail in your terms and conditions or in the contract that you use for the project. I think when I'm speaking to my client during the preliminary meeting, and if during that preliminary meeting where we're physically together, the subject of how I charge arises, I would be giving a client the headlines of how I operate procurement. Not to the same degree that I would explain it in terms and conditions, but I would probably be just surfacing some of the issues around procurement during the preliminary meeting. It would occur again in detail in the letter of engagement. It would be lightly referred to in onboarding, not to the same degree. So our details are in 1, terms and conditions, and in 3, letter of engagement. We are also going to make sure that we acclimatize our client to the concept in 2, preliminary meeting, and 4, onboarding. And then finally, one final time in detail in advance of commencement of procurement. So we get to the stage, we're about to start doing the purchasing. One final time, we make sure that our client has signed off again on the agreement of exactly how we are going to be charging our fees, and everything is explicit. So we are covered on multiple occasions. Now, there's so much to talk about. I'm sorry, this is probably I should have turned this into 3 different webinars. Principle. Yes. So when we are communicating as principal, I operate entirely as principal for procurement. We give our clients an overview, but we don't necessarily, exactly how we charge is our business. We don't have the same responsibility for transparency that we do when we're operating as agent. The problem with giving the client a lot of information when you operate as principal is you're opening up cracks for the client to dig down into. You're opening up opportunities for the client to request further clarification. So it tends to be the case that when we operate as principal, we give the client the overview, but we don't tell them exactly how we operate our business behind the scenes. Whereas when we operate as agent, our first and foremost, we are acting in the best interest of the client. The client's interests supersede ours. We operate with complete transparency, and all trade discounts belong to the client. Okay, we need to understand the lane that we're operating in. Are we operating as agent? Are we operating as principal? And we absolutely need to make sure that we are pristine in our methodology, depending which side we're on. So if we commingle funds, we are principal. Um, if we operate, if we're talking about markup, we're principal. If we're talking about handling fee, we're agent. If we over-explain as a principal and we give too much detail, we open the opportunity for our clients to become troublesome. Things change when we work with commercial clients. So the Consumer Act treats commercial clients differently from residential clients. So you probably want to investigate that. If you're working with a commercial client, that the implications on you are slightly less with regard to the Consumer Rights Act. You want to have your lawyer check everything, all of your documentation to make sure that it's consistent. Your insurances. Okay, so recently I've had clients, several clients have contracted with suppliers as principal, and the supplier has become insolvent, and the designer is left due the product to their client, but without a product from the supplier. So the designer is on the hook. Your professional indemnity insurance is probably not going to cover you for this. There are insurances that you can get that for retail purposes that might give you some cover in the event of a supplier becoming insolvent. You want to check that with your insurance broker. That's going to be someone like Hiscox, would be able to tell you of insurance products that you could perhaps invest in if you're worried about supplier insolvency affecting you when you're acting as principal. So insurances, be aware what they will and won't cover you for when it comes to procurement. Banking, if you are operating as agent, then you absolutely have to have a separate client account. You must not commingle that client money with your business banking. And ideally, you would actually arrange for the client to pay the supplier direct. And I know that opens up a whole other raft of challenges. This is all highly theoretical. You want to make sure that your terms and conditions and your contracts are very specific. And then we get into something that I wish I hadn't put on this list, which is paying by credit card, because if you pay with a private credit card, your own credit card, then you might have cover in the event of a supplier becoming insolvent. So there are cases of interior designers who bought using their personal credit card. The supplier went insolvent, and the credit card company backed them up or paid back the money because the business had gone insolvent. However, you're actually using a private credit card for a commercial purpose. The Consumer Rights Act, I think, kicks in, and you don't get the same coverage as you would do if you were using it for a private purchase, and then you're back out in the cold again. So sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. It's not a fix, but it can help. Anyway, I have spoken to you all, I know, at length about the White Label Studio, all of this stuff, all the schedules and all of the stuff is covered in the White Label Studio. Some of you have bought it. Thank you very much. I'm very grateful to you for your support of my business. It's coming in September. It is now at its full fat price of £500. Or if you join Business in a Box as a newish designer launching your business, my live program that runs in September, it's 1 day a week in the morning, Tuesday mornings, 10 till 11:30. We get together as a group and we push with the launch of a business. White Label Studio is going to be included in that. And this course is filling up nicely with some lovely students. So that's all good. Okay, my disclaimer again, please get everything checked by a lawyer. I'm doing my best. I hope this is an interesting conversation, but I am not a lawyer and I don't know the details of these various legislations intricately. So it'd be a good idea for you to check and not to take what I'm telling you here today on face value. This is not legal advice.